You're watching BBC Two. Now, in the making, meet Stephen Gottlieb, a man who makes lutes.
I suppose the golden century of the lute was the 16th century, when it was played all over Europe. In I think every country in Europe one could mention composers and players. It started as a fairly simple instrument with first 5 and then 6 pairs of strings, which became the classical lute, for which a great deal of very fine music was composed. It developed basically by becoming somewhat larger and by having strings added to its compass to, I guess, to compete with keyboard instruments, and also to make them somewhat louder so that you could play them with larger ensembles of instruments. But its heyday would have been the 16th and early 17th century. I don't really regard myself as a maker of medieval or Renaissance or Baroque instruments, as an early instrument maker, as many makers do. I think it's important not to tie instruments to a particular era of music. The back of a lute is made of a number of ribs, anything from 9 to 39, of various materials: sycamore, larch, yew, and occasionally ebony or rosewood. And these ribs have to be bent to shape over a bending iron, which is heated from the inside. Simply dry, no steam is used. And usually they bend quite easily because the wood is fairly thin. It's about 1.5 millimeters thick. The stage after having fitted the rib is to glue it to the next rib on the mould, and between that rib and the next one I put a strip of ebony. I mostly use hide glue made from animal skins, but it is in fact quite a strong glue when it's used properly. About 7 or 8 years ago, I decided to try and actually make a living making instruments. There was no one to learn from when I started, so I basically had to teach myself. In fact, I think I've really only just about, in the last couple of years, finished my apprenticeship, as it were, my self-apprenticeship. When all the ribs of the instrument have been glued together, the back is taped up with adhesive tape to prevent it splitting when it's pulled off the mould. Usually, though, with a bit of pulling and putting a palette knife in between the instrument and the mould, it'll come off fairly easily. if I weren't a lute maker, I'm quite sure I would be making something out of wood, which is, I think, one of the most appealing materials in the world. There are a few makers experimenting with plastics nowadays. Plastic backs, for instance, vacuum-formed backs. I don't myself use many modern products, mainly because the traditional ones are very satisfactory. Lute making, I think, has to be regarded as really rather a traditional craft. Unless you work in a certain way, you don't produce an object which produces a specific type of sound. The neck is made of mahogany, occasionally of pine, but which is a more traditional material. I use mahogany. This is spoke shaved and filed to shape, and then I veneer it with a thin, about 0.5 millimeter thickness of ebony on the back, and the fingerboard, about 2 millimeters thick, also of ebony, is glued onto the front. One of the things that most appeals to me about instrument making is the fact that one produces a useful object, out of which someone else produces something beautiful. It's very difficult to estimate how long it takes to make a lute, but I suppose the simpler instruments take something like 150 hours, the more elaborate ones anything up to 300 hours or so. The next important stage is to fix the neck onto the body. This is done traditionally simply by nailing it on from the inside of the lute, which people think is often a very primitive way of doing it, but in fact it's sufficiently strong and also easy to dismantle should one need to alter the action of the instrument, the height of the strings above the fingerboard, for instance. When the soundboard has been planed down to about 1.5 millimeters in thickness and scraped smooth, a decorative sound hole design is pierced out in the middle of it with very tiny carving chisels. This is called a rose design because some of the designs are very like flowers. And it's about the only piece of decoration on the lute, in fact. So one goes to quite a deal of trouble to make a nice, well-carved pattern. The soundboard of the lute is perhaps the most crucial part from the point of view of the final sound of the instrument. I make it from Swiss pine, very fine quality wood, quite knot-free, very straight-grained and close-grained. And I strengthen it with deep, rather thin bars of spruce, which are glued across the back of it, across the grain, rather like the joists of a floor. The lute has quite a large number of pegs. On the classical instrument, about 13, going up to 24 in the more elaborate types of lute, generally something like 13 or 15. And so they have to be made quite thin and delicate so as not to weigh down the head of the instrument too much. They're often made of fruit wood, such as plum or pear, and quite frequently of ebony, which is a hard wood. It's important to the player that they fit the peg box of the instrument well, because with the number of pegs that the lute has, if they don't work properly, it really is a very painful and irritating instrument to play. Lutes are best strung with gut, which is the traditional string material for plucked instruments, and still really the best. It means one can have a thin and really very tight string, which one can't quite get with nylon. The bass strings are generally nowadays of nylon floss wound with silver wire. In old lutes they would have been probably thick gut, which tends to produce a somewhat duller sound. The stringing has to be quite light, perhaps half the tension of guitar strings. The lute has frets to produce a clear tone from the strings, as all plucked instruments in fact do. Otherwise one would get a slightly dull tone, like when the violin is played pizzicato. Lute frets are made of gut, of various thicknesses, which can be slid slightly higher or lower to alter the intonation of the instrument. They're also rather easier to apply, and the player can replace them when they get worn quite easily. One of the things I find most appealing about the sound of the lute is its transparent, precise quality, which contrasts quite strongly with the tone of the guitar, which is rather dark and sombre.
In the Making next Thursday meets Catherine Mannheim, who makes jewellery and believes that it should be worn